Prince Edward erupts in fury. Thomas Arden had walked the same corridor inside the palace for 31 years. He knew every corner, every draught, every creak in the floor near the east window. He could do his morning round with his eyes half closed and still not miss a single detail. That was what made him good at his job. That was also what made it impossible to pretend he had not seen what he saw on that quiet Tuesday morning. The child came out of the morning room just as Arden was turning the corner. She was small for her age, always a little too neat in her appearance, always a little too composed for a child. She moved through the palace as if she had learned very early that the best way to survive inside its walls was to take up as little space as possible. Arden had noticed this before, the careful walk, the downcast eyes, but he had told himself it was simply her nature. Some children were quiet. Some children were still. But that morning, she was wearing a short-sleeved blouse, and as she reached for the door handle, her sleeve pulled back just enough. Arden caught only a glimpse before she was through the door and gone. He stood in the corridor for a moment longer than usual. Then he continued his round, his face perfectly neutral, his eyes straight ahead, the way decades of service had taught him to carry things he had not yet decided what to do with. The marks he had seen were dark and old. Not from yesterday. Not from the day before. They sat in a cluster along the inside of her left forearm, the kind that come from something pressing hard against soft skin. He had seen enough in 31 years to know that. He had daughters of his own. He also knew the particular look a child gets when they pull their sleeve down and meet someone's eyes, that flash of awareness, the small recalibration, the decision to act as if nothing happened. She had looked at him for exactly 1 second. And then she had looked away. Arden finished his round without saying anything to anyone. He spent the rest of the morning at his post near the south entrance, turning it over in his mind. He was not a man who acted on instinct alone. He believed in evidence, in certainty, in not creating problems where none existed. But he also believed in what he had seen. And the longer he stood there, the more clearly he understood that the two things were pulling in the same direction. By 4 in the afternoon, his mind was made up. He requested a private meeting with Commander Sylvia Holt, the head of palace security, and he told her everything in precise and careful language. He described exactly what he had seen, exactly when, and exactly where. He did not speculate. He did not dramatize. He simply laid the facts in front of her, the way a man lays bricks, one after another, until the shape of the thing becomes impossible to ignore. Commander Holt listened without interrupting. She had a way of listening that made you feel she was absorbing everything and filing it somewhere deep, somewhere private, somewhere she could retrieve it at the exact moment she needed it. When Arden finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him he had done the right thing. She told him she would look into it. She told him to speak to no one else about what he had seen, and that this was standard procedure for matters of a sensitive nature. Arden thanked her and left. He asked, just before the door closed, whether he would be informed of what happened next. Commander Holt's answer was a look that told him, gently but clearly, that the answer was no. The report moved through channels. This was how the palace handled things, carefully, quietly, through layers of people whose job it was to make sure that information arrived at its destination in the most manageable form possible. By the time it reached Prince Edward's private secretary, it had been summarized into a few careful sentences. A routine welfare observation flagged by a member of the security staff. Recommended for review at the earliest convenience. Standard protocol. His private secretary read it twice. He was a precise man with a long memory and a reliable instinct for when something was more serious than its language suggested. He did not file it. He did not send it to a committee. He printed it on a single sheet of paper, folded it once, and walked it directly to Prince Edward. Edward was standing at his desk when his secretary knocked. He was reviewing correspondence, half distracted, already thinking about the evening's schedule. His secretary placed the folded sheet in front of him without speaking. Edward looked up, read his secretary's expression, and picked up the paper. He read it once quickly. Then he sat down and read it again, slowly, and when he finished the second time, he set the paper flat on the desk and placed both hands beside it, very still, and said nothing at all for almost 2 full minutes. Then he asked his secretary to find Lady Cecily Ravenswood and bring her to his study at 7 o'clock that evening. Lady Cecily Ravenswood had been the child's personal aide and primary carer for nearly 18 months. She came with excellent references, a composed manner, and a fluency in palace life that made her seem as though she had always been there. She was the kind of person who never seemed flustered, who always had a sensible answer ready, who smiled at exactly the right moments. The child, on the surface, appeared to be well looked after. Meals were on time. Lessons were well organized. Every visible thing was in its proper place. She arrived at Edward's study at 7 o'clock exactly, which was itself a small performance, the punctuality of someone who knows they are being watched and wants to signal that they have nothing to hide. Edward was seated when she entered. He gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat, and for a moment they simply looked at each other with the particular politeness of two people who are both pretending that this is a normal conversation. He asked her, in a calm and measured voice, about the child's recent well-being. He asked about her daily schedule, her health, her mood. Cecily answered each question with confidence and warmth. She used the word wonderful twice. She used the phrase settling in beautifully at least once. She was convincing. She had clearly said these things before. Then Edward asked about the bruises. He watched her face with the focus of a man who had sat across from difficult people in difficult rooms for many years and had learned to read what happened in the half-second before the answer came. There was something there, a small adjustment, barely visible, like a person shifting their footing before they speak. She explained smoothly that the child had taken a tumble near the stables 2 weekends prior. She had been present, she said. The child had been seen to immediately. She had not filed a formal report because it had seemed so minor, and she was sorry if that had caused any confusion, and she would of course be more thorough going forward. Edward nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her, in the same calm voice, why, if the bruises were from a single fall 2 weekends ago, there appeared to be 2 distinct sets, at different stages of healing. The room went very still. Cecily opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she opened it again and began to say something about the stables being uneven ground, about how one fall can sometimes leave marks that look like 2 separate incidents, about how children do not always notice when they have hurt themselves. Edward raised one hand, very slightly, and she stopped. What followed was not what anyone who knew Edward might have expected. He was not a man associated with outbursts. His entire life had been shaped by the requirement to remain composed under pressure, to absorb difficulty without showing it, to present a steady face to the world regardless of what was happening beneath the surface. He had become so accomplished at this that some people assumed there was nothing beneath the surface at all. They were wrong. What came out of him in that room was not loud. It never rose above the volume of a serious conversation. But it filled every corner of the space with something absolute and unmistakable, the fury of a person who has understood, in the space of a few minutes, that something terrible has been happening very close to them, and that they did not see it, and that a child they were responsible for paid the price for that blindness. He told Cecily that she was suspended from all duties effective immediately. He told her she was not to go near the child under any circumstances. He told her that palace security had been informed and that if she left the premises before they had spoken with her, he would treat that as a decision she had made and respond to it accordingly. And he told her, still quietly, still evenly, that whatever had been happening inside this building, in rooms he trusted were safe, to a child in his care, it was over. That night. Without question. Cecily said nothing. She stood, and she left, and the door closed behind her. Edward sat alone for a long time after that. He did not sleep that night. He spent the hours between midnight and 5 in the morning going through records, schedules, access logs, the names of everyone who had spent regular time around the child in the past several months. His private secretary stayed with him, quiet and useful, refilling the tea that kept going cold. Commander Holt joined them just after 2, carrying her own files and the expression of someone who deeply regretted not pushing harder the first time the report crossed her desk. By morning, Edward had made several decisions. The first was to bring in a doctor who had no connection to the palace, no investment in its reputation, and no reason to soften what she found. Her name was Dr. Nora Blythe. She was a specialist in child welfare, known for being direct to the point of discomfort, which was exactly what Edward needed. She arrived at Windsor before 8 o'clock and was taken immediately to a private sitting room. The child did not know why she was there. She had been told only that a doctor was coming for a routine checkup, which was not entirely a lie. She sat on the small sofa in the sitting room with her hands folded in her lap, doing the thing she had learned to do so well, appearing fine. Dr. Blythe sat across from her and did not immediately begin asking questions. She sat for a moment and looked at the child with the kind of attention that is different from examination, warmer, less clinical, more like the gaze of someone who is simply deciding to be present with another person before anything else happens. Then she said, "You are not in any trouble. Nothing you say in this room will get you into trouble. I want you to know that before we start." The child looked at her for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands. Then she looked up again and gave a very small nod. The conversation that followed took a long time. Dr. Blythe was patient in a way that felt genuine rather than professional. She did not push. She did not fill silences with more questions. She allowed the child to find her own way to the things she needed to say, and she waited, and she listened, and she said, "That makes sense," and, "I understand," in a way that suggested she actually meant both. What she heard was not a dramatic account of terrible events. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to sit with, a child describing a life that had become very small, very careful, very focused on doing everything right so that nothing bad would happen. A child who had learned that the safest thing was to be invisible. A child who had stopped telling people when something was wrong because she had stopped believing it would help. Dr. Blythe delivered her findings to Edward in private later that afternoon. She used clear language and did not soften anything. The physical evidence was consistent with a pattern of incidents occurring over several months. The child's behavior, the way she spoke, the things she avoided and the things she returned to, all of it pointed in the same direction. Something had been wrong for a long time. The bruises that Arden had seen were not the beginning. They were simply the first sign that someone had looked closely enough to notice. Edward listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question: what did the child need right now, today, to begin feeling safe? Blythe told him. He wrote every word down. In the days that followed, several palace advisors came to Edward with a version of the same suggestion. They used different words, different framings, different levels of tact. But the message underneath was the same: this matter could be handled internally. Cecily's removal was already a significant step. A full outside investigation could draw attention, create stories, raise questions that would be difficult to answer. Surely there was a quieter way to reach the same outcome. Edward listened to each of them. He did not argue, because he had learned over many years that arguing with people who are committed to a position is rarely the most efficient use of energy. He simply informed them, one by one, that the appropriate authorities had already been contacted. That the matter was no longer something the palace had the authority to resolve on its own. That he had made this decision with full awareness of what it meant, and that it was not a decision he was willing to revisit. The conversations were short. Cecily's case moved into formal investigation. The evidence gathered was thorough and damning. She would face consequences that could not be softened or redirected by anyone with an interest in keeping things quiet. She would not be in a position of caring for children again. Edward asked to meet with Thomas Arden personally. Arden was brought to a small, plain room in the administrative wing of the palace, the kind of room where practical things happened, far from the grand spaces used for ceremony. He came in his uniform, upright and composed, though the composure cost him something. He had not expected this meeting. He had assumed that his role in the matter ended the moment he made his report, which was how these things usually worked. You passed the information along and then you went back to your post and you were not thanked, because thanking you would require acknowledging that the information had been significant, and that was its own kind of uncomfortable thing. Edward stood when Arden came in, which was not a gesture Arden had anticipated. He crossed the room and shook his hand, and he said, simply and plainly, that what Arden had done took real courage. That the easiest thing, the thing that the structure around him was designed to make easy, would have been to say nothing. To complete the round and go home and tell himself it was not his place. That he had not done that mattered. That it had changed things in ways that could not be undone, and that the child was in a better situation because he had chosen not to look away. Arden stood very still through most of this. He was not a person who received things easily. When Edward finished, there was a pause, and Arden looked briefly at the wall to his left, and when he looked back his expression was slightly different, not soft, exactly, but no longer as carefully closed. He said only that he had done what seemed right. Edward said that it was. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Recovery rarely is. The child began working with a counselor that Dr. Blythe had recommended, a calm, patient woman who came 3 times a week and who the child, after an initial period of extreme politeness and careful distance, gradually began to trust. There were good days and difficult days, and on the difficult days the child was now, very slowly, beginning to say so instead of managing it alone. Edward found himself uncertain about many things during this period. He had spent a lifetime being confident in rooms and hesitant only in private, but this situation reversed that in ways he had not predicted. He was confident about the decisions he had made. He was uncertain about the smaller, daily things, how to be present without being intrusive, how to offer comfort without making the child feel watched, how to show up consistently for someone who had learned not to rely on consistency. He was not naturally expressive. He found words for tender things difficult to locate. But he came to understand, through the conversations he kept having with Blythe, that what the child needed was not eloquence. It was presence. Regularity. The simple, repeated fact of someone being there. So he was there. Every day, in some form, a short visit in the afternoon, a brief walk in the garden when the weather allowed, a knock on the door in the evening to say good night. Not elaborate. Not overly planned. Just consistent. Just real. On a Wednesday afternoon about 3 weeks after the night in his study, Edward was walking through the corridor near the east wing when he passed the door to a small sitting room. The door was partially open. Inside, the child was sitting in the window seat with a book open in her lap. She was not reading. She was looking out at the garden, her face still in the afternoon light, her expression unguarded in the way that only happens when a person does not know they are being observed. She looked peaceful. Not performing peaceful. Actually peaceful, in the fleeting and real way that is different from the careful composed face she had always shown the world. Edward paused in the doorway. She heard him and turned, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He asked, quietly, whether she would like company. She considered it. Not an automatic yes, not the reflexive agreeableness of a child who has learned that agreeing is safer than refusing. An actual, genuine consideration, her eyes moving slightly, weighing it up. Then she moved over on the window seat, just enough to make room. Edward sat beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside the window, the garden was very green in the late afternoon light, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was making a sound that carried easily through the old glass. It was an ordinary moment. Small and unhurried and quiet. But something about it felt like the beginning of something real, not the end of difficulty, not the resolution of everything that had gone wrong, but the first solid step on ground that was finally, carefully, beginning to hold. End.